get into the conversation today. A couple topics we want to hit on. First and foremost, Myles Garrett heads to the podium to talk first time since he has decided to extend his career in Cleveland for very awkward. Quincy knew this was going to be a little awkward, right? I mean, you can't take back the things that he said. Um, and I thought he did a nice job of not trying to take back the things that he said, which I think people would have kind of taken some offense to. Um, he went out of his way to say no, not out of his way, but he answered, no, I don't regret it. No, you know what I mean? I don't regret saying that stuff. Ultimately, kind of pointed in a general direction to that it led to more conversation with Andrew Barry and more clarity for him. I don't know if that's actually true, but that seems like the easiest path or reason to point to for him. I still am going to stick to the idea, Q, that he just basically saw the writing on the wall and knew that he wasn't going to get moved and that he was never going to sit out games. And that if he wanted to have good players alongside him, he needed to make sure that free agents knew he was going to be a Cleveland Brown before free agency started. So that probably had to do with the timing of it. There was one quote, Q, that jumped out to me where although he never said like I regret this or that, he did say at one point that he wished he was a little more level-headed after the season, coming off a disappointing season. That's about as close to any regret that he showed, I thought, in the presser.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult position for Myles to be at because you don't want to look like a fool for asking for a trade, right? And that's kind of how this has been portrayed of him nationally, which like I've never heard of a team signing a top tier, the defensive player of the year to a big contract and get so much criticism for it, right? Like only that happens when Cleveland does it, right? Everything good, Cleveland do it. Oh, Cleveland bad, right? Just fantastic way that this team gets covered sometimes by national press. But yeah. Like, I think part of it is Myles saw the writing on the wall, like you said, and realized that he wasn't going to be able to force an outcome. And some of this was people talking to him, probably teammates of his, right? We've heard David Njoku say that we're going to talk to him, all this stuff.
Yeah.
And kind of talking him down a bit from where he was when the season ended. I can't blame Myles Garrett for being furious at the end of the season. They were a 3-win team. We thought this team could potentially make a run, right? If things went right. After an 11-win season, winning 3 games, having the second overall pick is just absolutely not where we want it to be. And, it's funny to put it this way, but it's true. Myles had the same reaction a lot of Browns fans had, right, after this season or during the season, right, where, we've heard it from Browns fans. They'll comment on here on the OBR or on my YouTube channel, and they'll be like, hey, I'm done with the Browns. I hate this team, this and that, right, because they're furious with how the season has went, and Myles had a similar reaction with the end of this season, right? Also, I think Jameis Winston brought this up way back in February, which is the scars of going 0-16. He was there, right? That still affects him. So when he sees a team go 3-13, he automatically goes back to, oh my God, we're going to tank again, right? Oh my God, we're going to strip this thing down and rebuild it. So it probably took a lot of constant conversations and reassurances from the front office saying, hey, we're committed to this core. We're not just going to fold it all up because we had one bad season. We're not going to overreact to that. And maybe that built some insurance over time. Also, some of the stuff was just straight up posturing, right? Like all the stuff right before the extension happened where, you're just throwing stuff out there. That's the usual kicking and screaming that you get from an agent before they have to make the deal, right? Like before that has to go down. We're seeing that we'll see how this Kirk Cousins things plays out, but a similar ordeal is going on in Atlanta. And we've seen ordeals like that before where it's like, oh, Lamar Jackson, it burned bridges, right,
Yeah.
between Baltimore and Lamar Jackson. And he can't go back. And then like 2 weeks later, a deal gets done. It's like, yeah, you got to use your leverage. And part of using your leverage is a little ugly. I also want to go back to something that you mentioned earlier, right?
Yeah.
Which is this idea of like Myles requests this trade and he had to have a lot of conversations with the front office that he says makes him feel better. It reminds me a lot of what happened with the Cavs this offseason. Not saying it's the same exact thing. It's not a one-to-one comp. There's obviously small differences here. But part of when the season ended last year, right, it was a little bit of a disappointment for the Cavs. They expected to be a 55-win team. They were a 48-win team. There was tension between Darius and Donovan Mitchell. And at the end of the season, the report was Darius Garland wanted out if they're going to bring back Donovan Mitchell, right? That was the report. You cannot have these two back. One of them's got to go. That was the talking point for most of summer. And what Darius says soft, it was, hey, me and Donovan just had to have some real conversations about what's going to have to happen, right, going forward to get better. And that actually, going through that ugliness cleared things up a little bit, made things a lot easier to move forward with. The Browns are talking about building a career-long relationship with Myles Garrett. Anybody who's been in a long-term relationship with anything and anybody knows that, it gets messy sometimes. It gets a little testy. But
no doubt,
getting through those situations and prospering through that is what makes a relationship strong, right? Like if you don't go through anything, then you don't really have any kind of test there. But with Myles and the Browns, this was definitely a strain on it. We've seen this with Kobe and the Lakers. We've seen this with guys before. They were able to get through it. It seems like Myles from the press conference is pretty like locked into this being a long-term deal, which again, I am surprised by, right? I thought Myles would kind of play this short terms, like, hey, yeah, I'm into the vision right now. We'll see what happens in the future. Kind of do that whole thing LeBron used to do, right? Where he would allude to the future, make sure you're still on the hot seat. He was like, nah, like he seemed pretty bought into like, hey, I'm going to be here for the rest of my career, and talk about it like that. Because what, he's 30 now. This contract takes him another 6 years. He's going to be 36 by the end of this deal. So, whatever conversations they had, and, I think so much of the GM job, and you can tell me what you think about this. Do you feel like we kind of focused a bit too much on, when it comes to the GM job, on stuff like draft picks and like specific free agent signings instead of like worrying about what the actual job entails?
Yeah, like I don't even think it. Not very often ever do we talk about like the relationships that a general manager has to foster with his players, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's never about that. It's about draft picks. It's about the moves they make, right? It's about building the roster. Because really, it's not that often that, yes, the negotiations, have to be done in good faith, and there has to be some trust there from both sides. But like on a day-to-day basis, they're not talking to the GM usually. It's only around when your contract's coming due, or you're looking at restructuring or something like that they probably have a lot of conversations with Andrew Berry or any GM. So you wonder, and Myles initially, when he brought this up, he was applauded by the fans for kind of putting the pressure on. If you remember that, right? It was like,
well, because fans felt like Myles did at the time, which is like because fans were mad at the team for losing as much as they did. They're watching the playoffs. We all know you get more mad at your team during the playoffs when you aren't in it, because you're like, why aren't we in this? Why can't we have these moments like this? Why can't we feel like Detroit fans feel at the first game, right? Like it's all of that stuff kind of combined. And the reason I brought up the whole Andrew Berry thing, right, is I feel like a huge part of what a general manager needs to be able to do is understand where sentiment might be and be able to convince those that you need to convince that it's not going in a direction that you think, right?
Yeah.
Like people talked about this feels like years ago, right, Brad? But it was just a few months ago. Cam Ward, Shador Sanders, they don't even want to come to Cleveland. Look at that dumpster fire of a situation. If I were them, I would force my way out of Cleveland. I would make sure, like, all this silly talk about players who, quite frankly, like, aren't good enough to demand that, right? But either way, right, Andrew Berry, once these guys start meeting with them, what do we find out? Oh, Cam Ward, more than okay. He actually wants to come to Cleveland. Shador Sanders, more than okay. He actually wants to come to Cleveland, right? After months of conversation with Myles Garrett, it seems like yes, there is the money aspect of this, obviously, but it does feel like there's legitimate buy-in from Myles Garrett here from the contract. Because, again, he's not doing that short-term, like, we'll reevaluate this in a couple of years kind of language that you see from players who sign an extension just because they feel like the money was right. Like, there's some kind of buy-in to the vision. I don't think it's going to manifest why he bought into the vision this offseason, because they weren't going to do anything this offseason to be able to keep him outside, like getting Matthew Stafford or something like that. But I think there's some kind of buy-in there, and I think that's where Andrew Berry does get some credit here is – we've seen these situations where people have gone into it thinking that Cleveland, that nobody's going to want to come to Cleveland, this and that. But it seems like he's able to go in there and argue for a vision, present that vision. And, like, I think the admirable part about all of this is that, he's not going to fold on that vision, right? Yeah. There was plenty of opportunity to fold or, the nightmare scenario for me is like, hey, we get so desperate to keep Myles Garrett that we offer a Godfather deal to, like, Arizona to get Kyler Murray and put ourselves back in the same situation we were with Deshaun Watson, because we know Kyler Murray, Texas A&M, Myles Garrett's former teammate, that'll get Myles excited to play here. That would be what keeps him. He didn't have to do that. To get that buy-in. He was able to just talk to him and do it. And is that sexy? No. Is that going to be leading on ESPN, or is that going to make Stephen A. Smith talk nice about you on First Take or Get Up? No. But these are the real tangible things that if you look around at GMs who are good at their job, they're able to do stuff like this, right? The Eric DeCosta, everybody thought the Ravens were going to have to trade for like a giant wide receiver to be able to keep Lamar Jackson. All they had to do was sign Odell Beckham, right? Like, that's all they ended up having to do to placate and change the offensive coordinator. This is, as much as I think Andrew Berry deserves some criticism for some of his drafts, right? I think 2021 draft, objectively not good. 2022 draft, objectively not good. You can look at it in a lot of different ways, even if you measure for, like, what they had. Were not great drafts. No. And he deserves criticism for that. But if you look at his ability to retain players, the fact that while this Myles thing was going on, players were actively saying, he need to come back. No, we got something going, right? Like, come on, man, come on back. That was the sentiment from every veteran on this team. That means something, right? After you go 3-13, 3-14, I mean, the Cavs might finish the whole season with less losses than you. Right? Yeah. That's how bad the season went.
That's how bad it was,
And for every veteran on that team to be like, nah, it ain't that bad. That says a lot about what's going on there from a structure standpoint. And I do think that being able to, this is a huge win for the Browns. I know some Browns fans are going to try to dice it up as something. Yeah. I saw Jason Lloyd, put some smear out there about Myles when it comes to, like, his work ethic and stuff like that. And Myles responded accordingly to that campaign from him. But it's this thing here where I keep seeing it's like, hey, people keep expecting the Browns to do the dysfunctional thing. They don't do the dysfunctional thing, and then they get criticized for not doing the dysfunctional thing. I'm having people message me about, was Myles Garrett worth whatever we paid him? He's Myles Garrett. He's worth it, right? And if the Browns could work around $45 million a year guaranteed for Deshaun Watson, they can work around this contract for Myles Garrett.
Yeah.
And Myles Garrett ain't Deshaun Watson, right?
Right.
You ain't trading him from where he was successful, put him in a new situation. You're just saying, hey, Myles, keep doing that thing that you do at a generational level. And yeah, so a lot of this conversation about Myles Garrett, I think for whatever reason, people have made an effort to skew it negatively, whether because they're mad at Myles for not coming to their team, or they're mad at Myles for not going to a sexier team. I think that's a lot of the national outlets. Like, oh, we finally get to pry Myles Garrett away from the Cleveland Browns, put him somewhere that we can market like Buffalo or something like that. And that's not going to happen anymore. So now they're mad at Cleveland for doing what they should have done. But go ahead.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It was kind of, we were on the React and we were watching a video of a national, I think it was Fox Sports, right, or FS1 or whatever, and they were talking about it, and they were all talking like, basically like free Myles, right? Like he was being held high. Like, we got to get him out of there. We got to get him out of there. He's got to get free, like and that was the tone they were taking during the trade request. Like, he deserves better than this. And those people are reacting in kind now, like, we spoke that way, but the Browns handled their business and he's back. So it's a weird dynamic nationally. It's like they don't want him to be here. They want, you said, they want the sexy move, right? The NBA move. Yeah.
National media is just reactionary now, right? Like, I think that's been the overwhelming tone shift over the last few years, is that a lot of national media is just reactionary. It's just kind of these knee-jerk reactions that we put a megaphone up to and blast out to everybody. And that has its issues, right? But I think also because it's so reactionary, we're not really thinking it through. Because a lot of people were like, well, Myles deserves better. He deserves to go to a team that's actually trying to win. The Browns have been criticized the last 3 years for moves they made that seemed too aggressive for trying to win for the situation, right? Yep. Like, that's been a criticism of the Cleveland Browns, right? Oh, you're making a move for Deshaun Watson, right? Like, on one hand, the Browns are being killed for being too aggressive to try to win, for moving on from Baker Mayfield to Deshaun Watson, which was a very aggressive win now kind of move, and it did not pay off, right? Blew up in their face. Fine. Yep. Everybody got egg on their face. I think that's why Jimmy has been actually made the leap as owner, right? Because that was the final embarrassment for Jimmy Haslam, where he said, you know what? Andrew handles all of it, right? Like, first it was Hugh Jackson, then it was going 0-16, then it was hiring Freddie Kitchens. Like, it's interesting. Since they went 0-16, there's been like a ladder of like things where you're like, no, Jimmy put his finger on that, and then it blows up, and now he's just like, I ain't got nothing to do with none of this anymore.
Exactly. Yeah.
But it's been interesting to see that move be portrayed that way, because people are simultaneously making the argument that the Browns have not tried to win enough for Myles Garrett, while the Browns have made millions of win-now decisions that they've been criticized for trying to win too fast. So it's this interesting balance of like, oh, is it really that we're criticizing what the Browns are doing, or is it that, hey, we got the Browns on the rundown, we got to criticize them, because that's what we do with the Browns. They're a bad team. Let's criticize them. And it kind of happens there. And I'm not saying the Browns aren't worthy of criticism. Obviously, they are. But I think everybody deserves their criticism to be, how would I put this, consistent. Right? Like, if you're going to criticize the Browns for being aggressive here, trying to win now, and you're saying, hey, signing Myles Garrett, it resets the window on when you can rebuild, that's a criticism I don't agree with, but it's fair. Right? Okay, if you think the Browns should rebuild, re-signing Myles is not the best move. I think that no matter what you do, having Myles Garrett on your team is the best move. But, that's a disagreement. That's fine. I have no problem with that. But when it's this flip-floppy stuff where it's like, oh, well, the Browns, free Myles Garrett, that poor soul, the Browns have done nothing to try to make him win. Meanwhile, TJ Watt's sitting out there with less playoff wins than Myles Garrett, and it doesn't look like the Steelers are doing anything to try to make him win. And, like, another thing, and we're starting to see a little bit of this, but if anybody needs to be freed, look at Joe Burrow right now in Cincinnati, right? Like, having that superstar year. winning 9 games or whatever they did, won 9 or 10 games, missed the playoffs. They're the one team that beat Kansas City in the AFC since Tom Brady did it in New England.
Yep.
And they're the least aggressive team to try to get back into that spot to beat Kansas City, right? Like, but the Browns get criticized because they do bring back somebody. Meanwhile, Cincinnati has the quarterback, has all the stuff that we want.
Everything.
Yeah, but they're not doing the little stuff, right? They're letting their Myles Garrett walk, which is crazy to me, right? So I don't mind it. I think in the long run, it's a good decision. I think Myles Garrett re-signing is obviously a good decision. It's just blown my mind how people... Like, you could be down on the Browns, but you're not going to convince me that signing Myles Garrett is a bad thing, because that's the greatest player we've had on this franchise since probably Jim Brown. You're not going to tell me retaining that dude's a bad thing. People are treating this like we re-signed Jed Wills, and it don't make any sense to me. Or like we signed Nick Chubb to a giant contract after coming off an ACL injury or something like that, right? Like, it's like, this is not unsure. This is Myles Garrett. Y'all would have been thrilled if he signed this contract literally anywhere else.
Yeah. He has, you're absolutely right. They have, there's a lot of spin going on for the people that just have to be negative about the Browns, right? And so they're trying to turn this into a negative because they handled it, pretty much perfectly. Me and you talked about the test that AB was up against here this offseason, and so far he passed with flying colors as far as the Myles Garrett situation. This question was interesting here. I'm just going to read this one part of it today. So, Jimmy not taking the meeting with you, was there a connection between that and the fact that this happened so soon after that? I mean, was that them showing you that, we're locking arms here and we want to keep you here, we're absolutely not trading you? Or was there no connection between that and the end result? Myles' answer was, I'm going to say that just the conversation opened up for me and AB to talk more. Jimmy took a bit of a back seat, leaning on AB and our relationship. I think that's for the better. You want to have a good relationship with your owner as well as your GM. And him and I have had many discussions and conversations over the years, and he helped me see what the future can really hold for us. So, interesting that the whole Haslam thing, which was brought up right before, 2 days before he signed the contract, and it, he is saying that pointed him back to more conversation with Andrew Berry, which ultimately ended in him signing the contract. Do we know if that's ultimately the truth? I don't know. I'll take, it's hard to take Myles at his word at this point, but either way, Andrew Berry was able to paint a picture to Myles that created a sense of urgency that got him to sign the contract before free agency started and understand that he wasn't going to get moved. And ultimately, it never got as ugly as many people projected it to be.
Yeah, I think AB probably just did a good job of laying out what the roadmap is here. Also, I wonder if that's when the no trade clause got thrown into the deal, because that's been the most under talked about element of this contract, is that there is a no trade clause. And I've seen people even talk about it as if the no trade clause is for the Browns. I'm like, no, that's for Myles Garrett, right? That's so he can say no to if he did state he wants to go to a contender, so that, hey, if you do trade me, you can't just trade me anywhere, right? And he has some leverage in
power. If he comes back to the table with the same request in 2 years, it gives him more leverage, right?
Yeah, and he's like, I'm older. Y'all still ain't got the quarterback. If the window is what the window is, it seems a lot more reasonable. Plus, he has that control there.
Yeah.
So I wonder if that's when the conversation opened up to include a no trade clause. Maybe Myles Garrett is a watcher of the LBR or my YouTube channel, but because we've been talking about it for weeks, so it probably makes sense to end this with that. But yeah, I think that was there, and he laid it out. He was like, hey, probably, there was nothing we were going to do this offseason that was going to convince you, right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't think Kenny Pickett was a move to convince him here, right?
No.
But, get this thing a couple years. We trust where we're going to be, and we're going to get this thing back to winning. It was just one season, one down year. Overall, the Browns have been much better with Andrew and Kevin Stefanski at the helm than before, significantly better. So, just kind of laid out the options. It made sense to Myles. It made sense to his agent, and they made the move to go ahead and sign the deal. That doesn't mean that like Myles Garrett is going to become Joe Thomas now and like he's going to be locked in here forever. But it does mean that you get time, right, to be able to make your move here. And if Andrew Berry, again, this is why I said this offseason is going to be the test of Andrew Berry to figure out, like, is this the dude that needs to be the GM for the next, he's a young guy, right? So we're talking about 10, 20, 15, 30 years possibly of Andrew Berry as the GM. If he wants to prove that he's that guy, this is the offseason to do it, right? You got to keep Myles Garrett on the roster. You have to navigate this offseason where it looks like there's no good option at quarterback and figure out how to get by for a year if you want to get to next year to get your long-term answer, or how to squeeze some kind of answer out of this year. You're going to have to get creative, right? Because I don't think it's simple. It's like, oh, you could just take a guy at 2, right? Like, it's not one of those years where it's simple. I would have, and Brad, I wish it was. Right?
I wish it was, too.
I wish it was, right?
I wish it was, too.
Andrew wish it was, right? Like, everybody, like, if the Browns pass on a quarterback at 2, I would feel pretty confident in their evaluation of it. Not because like I trust the Browns evaluation, but I'm like, nobody wants that to be the answer more than Cleveland. Right? Like if they say no to it, that means that they saw enough to where they're like, I just can't do it. Right?
Yeah.
Like because
they
we
want
are as
it to
desperate.
be easy.
Yeah.
They want it to be a yes.
That's the easy button, right? If Jaden Daniels were in this draft, you could take him with the number 2 overall pick or trade up the number 1 to get him. That is the easy button. Like, we got lucky. There's a guy there, a quarterback. Unfortunately, I don't feel like that's the year. This is the year where you can hit the easy button. This seems like a down year for quarterbacks. And it just is what it is there, right? You got to navigate that and figure out how you're going to work out this one. And you're going to have to get creative, and you're going to have to do shit that people aren't going to think is good, right? To be fair, we criticized the hell out that Russell Wilson move for Pittsburgh. Ended up, being fine for them, right? You're going to have to make unpopular moves at the court. Nothing you do for the rest of like the offseason at quarterback is going to make people go, oh, yeah, I'm excited about that, right? If you draft Cam Ward, there are going to be a lot of detractors to that decision. If you draft Shador Sanders, there are going to be a lot of detractors to that decision. If you sign Kirk Cousins, there are going to be a lot of detractors to that decision. If you sign not Cam Ward, if you sign Aaron Rodgers or Russell Wilson, there's going to be a ton of detractors to that conversation. So, we're trying to live in a world where like the Browns could do something and nobody's going to be critical of it, but that just isn't where we're at, right? Everything they can do at quarterback is incredibly polarizing. So it is what it is. You just got to get through it.
It is. So that's what I want to talk about next with you, Q, is basically everything that is going on with the quarterback room. So let's